The Grayson house had been empty for 36 years when the photograph surfaced, an image buried under warped floorboards, discovered only because a local historian stepped wrong and collapsed part of the hallway. Dust rose in slow spirals as he knelt to investigate what had splintered beneath his boot. There, trapped between rotted boards, lay a single envelope sealed with brittle adhesive, stamped only with the year 1987. Inside, the photograph waited like a forgotten confession, untouched since the night the Grayson family abandoned the property without explanation. At first glance, the image appeared ordinary, a faded snapshot of the house's porch at dusk, framed with the uneven border typical of inexpensive cameras of the 1980s. But the longer the historian studied it, the more something felt distinctly wrong, not only in the composition, but in the emotional temperature of the scene. The house looked newer in the photograph than it did now, but still tired, as though age had already taken root in its frameboards. A lone figure stood on the right side of the porch, a small boy dressed in out-of-date clothing, staring directly at the camera with an unreadable expression. The historian froze, unable to ignore the unsettling certainty forming in his mind. According to every record he had reviewed, no child lived in the Grayson house in 1987. When he showed the photograph to the county records officer, she frowned, insisting he must be mistaken. The Graysons had been an older couple with no children, no grandchildren, and no dependents staying with them. Their files were thin, almost suspiciously so. Yet the photograph contradicted every official document. The boy's presence was not just unexplained, it was impossible. The historian brought the image to an archivist with expertise in photographic anomalies, hoping for a technical explanation. Double exposure, shadow artifact, lens flare. But the archivist shook his head. The child was solid, casting a soft shadow, consistent with the porch beam behind him. His feet aligned perfectly with the warped floorboards. The light on his jacket matched the low evening sun. "This isn't a trick of the camera," the archivist murmured. This child stood there. Whoever he is, he was real. The revelation forced the investigation wider. Former neighbors were tracked down, some now living in towns hours away. Their recollections varied, but they agreed on one point. The Graysons had always kept to themselves. One neighbor admitted she occasionally heard voices through the trees, one high-pitched like a child, but assumed it came from visiting relatives. Yet no visitor had ever been documented, and the Graysons themselves never mentioned family. The contradictions formed a small storm in the historian's mind. If a child had lived there, why was he erased from every record? Why had the Graysons insisted for years that they lived alone? The historian returned to the abandoned house, determined to trace the photograph's origin. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and soaked insulation. Wallpaper peeled like shedding bark. In the living room, he found something he had overlooked on his previous visit. A warped wooden trunk shoved against the wall, coated in a gray layer of dust thick enough to suggest it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside were neatly folded blankets, a set of small clothes, and a children's storybook with a torn spine. None of these items appeared in the Graysons' official inventory taken after their departure. The discovery raised a disturbing implication. Someone had lived here, hidden from public view, and their existence had been intentionally removed from official memory. But the most alarming moment came when the historian examined the trunk's underside. Scratched into the wood, barely visible without angled light, were initials. CG, carved again and again in uneven strokes, as though made by a small, impatient hand. The historian felt the weight of the photograph intensify. The child in the image wasn't simply present, he belonged here. He had lived in this house, walked its creaking floors, slept under its leaking roof, and left marks behind that only a deeply isolated life could produce. This realization reshaped the central question of the investigation. The mystery was no longer simply who the child was, but why his presence had been erased, and why the Graysons had vanished so abruptly in 1987. And then, as the historian matched the initials to the family name, a chilling possibility emerged. The boy wasn't an outsider or distant relative. He may have been a Grayson, a family member never acknowledged, never admitted, and never allowed to exist beyond the boundaries of this photograph. The mystery was no longer a curiosity. It was a wound in the history of the house, quietly bleeding through every detail the Graysons had tried to conceal. The photograph, now digitized for closer inspection, became the centerpiece of a deeper investigation. High-resolution scans revealed textures and details that the naked eye had missed. The fibers of the boy's corduroy jacket, the exact angle of the porch beam's shadow, even the faint smudge on the windowpane beside him, all of it pointed toward authenticity. There was no evidence of tampering, overlay, or double exposure. Yet one detail stood out above all: the boy's placement. He was positioned too precisely, too knowingly, as though he were waiting for the shutter. This was not a candid moment. It was a deliberate, almost staged capture. A forensic photo analyst was brought in from Harrisburg, specializing in late 20th century amateur photography. She noted a subtle but telling detail. The grain pattern in the shadows indicated a low-light snapshot taken without flash, likely handheld, likely rushed. Someone had taken this photograph quickly, perhaps secretly. She pointed to the faint blur in the lower edge of the frame. The photographer's hand wasn't steady, she said. Whoever took this, they were nervous. That observation shifted the investigation dramatically. Until then, the historian had assumed the photograph was a mundane family keepsake. Now it resembled documentation, evidence of something, captured hastily before circumstances prevented a second attempt. Following this new lead, the historian revisited county records, but the Grayson file remained conspicuously bare. No school enrollment documents, no medical records, no trace of a child registered at their address. If CG truly lived in the house, the child had been kept entirely off the books. That possibility drew the attention of a retired social worker familiar with the region's history. She revealed that during the 1970s and 1980s, rural counties occasionally saw cases where children were informally taken in by extended relatives, but never formally declared custodial wards. Some were kept hidden to avoid inquiries related to custody disputes, truancy, or underlying health issues. The Graysons, known for their aversion to outside involvement, fit that profile uncomfortably well. Still, the historian refused to rely on speculation. He turned to physical evidence inside the house. Back in the living room, beneath the water-stained wallpaper, he uncovered faint markings. Height measurements scratched directly into the wall. The dates beside the lines spanned from 1981 to 1986. The initials CG appeared beside 3 of them. This discovery solidified what the photograph had already suggested. The child was not a visiting relative but a long-term, secret inhabitant of the home. But inconsistencies continued to surface. Former neighbors offered contradicting memories. One recalled seeing a small figure playing behind the barn, though only once. Another insisted she never saw or heard a child at all, but noticed the Graysons carrying supplies that didn't align with 2 adults living alone. Bags of children's vitamins, a box of drawing pencils, a crate of powdered milk. These observations, fragmented and unreliable on their own, formed an unsettling mosaic when assembled together. The child's existence was visible only through glimpses, never acknowledgement. Searching for documents outside official channels, the historian examined microfilm at the local library, combing through newspapers from the late 1970s onward. An article from 1980 caught his attention, a short piece describing a custody dispute involving a distant branch of the Grayson family in Ohio. A child was mentioned only briefly, initials withheld. No follow-up article ever appeared. The trail went cold, as if the entire situation had been quietly resolved or deliberately suppressed. Just as the narrative seemed to stabilize around a hidden child hypothesis, a new detail in the photograph upended everything. Under magnification, the analyst identified a second figure, barely visible, standing behind the torn curtain in the left window. Only the outline of a shoulder and the suggestion of a face could be discerned, but the direction of the gaze was unmistakable, toward the child on the porch, not toward the camera. This second presence, invisible in casual viewing, introduced a second layer of secrecy. If the boy had not been alone, who else was inside the house? The historian examined the negative again, searching for any sign of tampering. None appeared. The second figure, though faint, matched the lighting and perspective perfectly. It was real, and if there was a hidden adult or older youth inside, the question shifted from why was a child concealed to what were the Graysons afraid to reveal? For the first time, the historian considered a darker route, the possibility that the Graysons were not simply protecting the child from the outside world. They may have been protecting the outside world from something occurring within the home. False leads began to multiply. A neighbor insisted the child was merely a visitor. A former postal worker recalled delivering mail addressed to a C. Grayson, though he couldn't remember if that occurred before or after 1987. The dates blurred, the testimonies contradicted each other, and the timeline began to shift under the weight of conflicting memories. Then a breakthrough occurred. At the county's off-site storage facility, a mislabeled box was discovered containing unindexed welfare documents from the mid-1980s. Among them, a partially redacted note referenced an unannounced visit to a rural residence occupied by Harold and Elaine Grayson. The note ended abruptly, with no follow-up report or closure statement. Whatever the investigator had found or witnessed was lost in bureaucratic silence. This absence, more than any discovery, suggested the truth lay not in what was recorded, but in what had been erased. The photograph, once a curious anomaly, now stood as the last surviving trace of a story someone had worked very hard to bury. The revelation began not with a document or a sudden confession, but with a single photograph corner, an overlooked detail nearly lost beneath years of dust. While re-examining the envelope in which the porch photo had been found, the historian noticed faint impressions on the paper, as though another sheet had once rubbed against it. Under angled light, the ghost of an indentation appeared, the outline of a second photograph removed long ago. This discovery reignited the search for missing evidence. If a second image had existed, then someone had deliberately taken it, and later chosen to hide or destroy it. The historian returned to county storage, studying the partially redacted welfare note with renewed urgency. A small scribble in the margin, nearly illegible, caught his attention. Condition of child. Unclear. The phrasing was not typical for welfare reports, which usually recorded specifics. Instead, it hinted at uncertainty, hesitation, and perhaps fear. Even more telling was the abrupt ending of the note. No follow-up visit, no outcome, no official closure. It was as though the investigation had been cut off before it could begin. Pursuing this lead, the historian tracked down the retired welfare officer whose signature appeared faintly at the bottom. She agreed to meet him after weeks of deliberation. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled at the edges, not from age but from memory. She recalled visiting the Grayson house in 1986 after an anonymous report suggested a child might be living there without proper care. When she arrived, Harold Grayson answered the door, polite yet tense. She remembered the smell of antiseptic in the hallway and a faint rustling from a back room, though Harold insisted it was the family dog. She never saw the child directly, only a small shadow darting past a doorway at the end of the hall. Before she could question Elaine, Harold abruptly ended the visit, citing illness and requesting a reschedule. But the reschedule never occurred. The case, she said, was quietly reassigned and then removed entirely from her workload. The historian asked her why. The retired officer took a long, unsteady breath. Because someone above me didn't want that house investigated. Her confession expanded the mystery to a new scale. If oversight had been suppressed from within the welfare system, there had to be a deeper issue at play, something sensitive enough to compel silence. Searching through old county personnel files, the historian found the welfare supervisor assigned during that period. His record contained no misconduct, but there were gaps, months where reports should have been filed but weren't, unexplained reassignments, sudden transfers. A pattern emerged suggesting systemic pressure rather than individual negligence. A breakthrough came when the historian obtained a box of unprocessed microfilm from a local newspaper. A journalist in 1987 had been investigating a series of state-run child welfare disputes. situations involving children placed informally with extended family members to avoid the stigma of institutional care. Among the journalist's notes was a typed line referencing a Grayson case, rural unclear guardianship, potential concealed dependent. The article was never published. Weeks later, the journalist left the paper abruptly. No reason was ever recorded. The pieces began aligning: a hidden child, a suppressed welfare inquiry, a buried newspaper lead. But the most crucial revelation waited inside the Grayson house itself. While inspecting the attic, the historian uncovered a narrow crawl space sealed behind a panel of plywood. The air inside was still and cold, smelling faintly of soap and something metallic. At the far end of the crawl space sat a small mattress, thin as paper, surrounded by scattered belongings: a child's sweater, a cracked plastic cup, and a series of drawings. The drawings depicted the house, always from the inside, never with open doors or windows. In every drawing, a larger figure stood nearby, sometimes smiling, sometimes looming, sometimes faceless. One drawing stood apart from the rest. It showed the porch exactly as seen in the photograph, but with a second figure behind the child. The outline matched the faint silhouette visible in the window. Beneath the drawing, written in shaky letters, was a name: Caleb. The initials carved in the trunk, CG, now had a full identity: Caleb Grayson. But the historian's realization deepened as he examined the child's aged possessions. Several items bore inventory tags from a state-run children's residence that had operated until 1981, a temporary housing facility for wards awaiting placement. Its shutdown, documented as abrupt and underfunded, had displaced dozens of children. Many were placed with relatives, some with foster families, and a few vanished into administrative limbo. Caleb appeared to be one of those children, placed informally with the Graysons after the institution's closure. Why then had he been hidden? The retired welfare officer's words returned with chilling clarity. The child's condition, left vague in records, likely referred to a developmental or behavioral issue, one the under-resourced system was unwilling or unprepared to manage publicly. Families who accepted such placements sometimes concealed the child to avoid scrutiny, especially in rural communities where intervention was seen as intrusive. But the drawings told a different story, one of isolation, confinement, and an existence limited to the boundaries of the house. And then came the final piece: a signed document found crumpled at the bottom of the crawl space, bearing the faded crest of the State Welfare Office. It was incomplete, unsigned by the supervising officer, but the text was legible. It referenced the immediate reassessment of placement viability and concerns regarding the dependent's safety and psychological welfare. Someone had attempted to remove Caleb from the home, but before the reassessment could take place, the Graysons vanished. The revelation hit with the weight of decades. The child in the photograph was not a passing visitor, not an apparition of memory, but a lost ward of the state, hidden, unacknowledged, and ultimately abandoned by the very systems meant to protect him. The photograph was not simply evidence. It was the final glimpse of a child disappearing into the cracks of a failing institution. In the weeks that followed the discovery in the crawl space, the investigation shifted from uncovering hidden history to understanding its consequences. The photograph, once a haunting anomaly, had transformed into a crucial artifact revealing the systemic failures surrounding Caleb Grayson's life. Yet, as the historian pieced together the final timeline, one question remained painfully unresolved. What became of the child after 1987? The abandoned house provided few clues. The Graysons' personal items had been left behind in disarray. Dishes still resting in the sink, a half-written grocery list pinned under a magnet, and coats hung by the door as though their owners had stepped out only minutes before. But the crawl space, the hidden room where Caleb had lived, told a different story. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of hurried escape, just the slow accumulation of dust over items untouched for decades. Whatever happened in 1987, it occurred decisively and without return. The historian presented his findings to state archives, prompting a review of old welfare cases long considered dormant. The rediscovery of Caleb's incomplete file sent ripples through administrative circles. Some officials viewed it as a tragic oversight from an era when underfunded departments struggled to track vulnerable children. Others saw it as a moral indictment, proof of how easily a child could vanish when institutions chose silence over accountability. The historian, aware that bureaucratic retrospection would never bring clarity to the boy's fate, focused instead on tracing personal connections that might lead to surviving family. His search eventually led to a distant Grayson relative living in Ohio, a woman in her 70s who initially resisted discussing family history. When she finally agreed to speak, her tone was cautious, as though opening a door sealed for years. She remembered hearing about a young boy, a troubled little soul, she said, whose mother had died unexpectedly, leaving no stable guardian. Rumor suggested he had been shuffled between relatives before the state intervened. But when the historian showed her the photograph, her expression changed. She touched the image lightly, recalling the boy's name with a mixture of sadness and recognition. "Caleb," she whispered. "He was sweet, sensitive. They said he needed more than anyone could give." She confirmed that Harold and Elaine had offered to take him in, believing the quiet of rural life might help him heal. But the arrangement had never become official, likely because of concerns about their age and health. Still, when the facility closed, Caleb was sent to them anyway, a gesture made informally through verbal agreement rather than legal placement. The woman remembered hearing that Caleb struggled socially and rarely spoke, preferring small spaces and predictable routines. She described him as perceptive, but fearful, often clinging to objects or people he trusted. Her memory aligned precisely with the artifacts found in the crawlspace. When asked why the Graysons had hidden him, she hesitated before offering a painful explanation. They were afraid he'd be taken away. They loved him, but they didn't trust the system, and maybe they knew they weren't equipped to care for him properly. She sighed, weighing the tragedy of flawed intentions. They tried to protect him, but in the end, they hid him from the very people who might have helped. This revelation reframed the entire narrative. Caleb's isolation had not been malicious at its core, but born from a misguided belief that secrecy equaled safety. Still, the consequences had been devastating. Without institutional oversight, the Graysons bore the full weight of responsibility, and when Caleb's emotional or behavioral difficulties intensified, as suggested by the welfare note, they lacked the resources to seek help. The historian theorized that the unannounced visit in 1986 triggered fear that their arrangement would be exposed. That fear, festering for months, may have culminated in their sudden disappearance. Yet the question remained: where did they go? Newspaper archives from 1987 contained a small, easily missed report about a couple found deceased in a car at a rest stop 2 states away, apparent victims of carbon monoxide poisoning. The names were withheld pending family notification, but the date aligned precisely with the Graysons' disappearance. An archived death certificate confirmed what local records had obscured. Harold and Elaine had died together, leaving no mention of a dependent. There was no record of Caleb being with them. This absence, the space where a child should have been listed, became the most haunting detail of all. The historian continued searching for signs of Caleb beyond 1987. No school enrollments, medical visits, adoption filings, or criminal records matched his profile. It was as though he dissolved into the gaps of history the moment the Graysons left the house. State agencies offered no clarity. Decades-old records were incomplete or missing. Caleb's last documented existence remained the photograph on the porch, standing still at the threshold of a home already collapsing around him. The emotional impact of the revelation was profound. Viewers of the historian's findings described feeling as though the photograph had shifted from eerie to devastating. No longer an image of a mysterious child, but a final glimpse of a lost life forced into invisibility. The historian himself felt a growing responsibility, not to decode the last unknowns, but to ensure Caleb's story would not be buried again. He compiled the evidence, testimonies, drawings, and welfare documents into an archive accessible to future researchers, naming it the Caleb Grayson Collection, insisting that even incomplete histories deserved preservation. The aftermath extended beyond one child's forgotten fate. The case prompted renewed attention to the practices of informal child placement in the late 20th century, exposing the vulnerabilities of children who fell between institutional cracks. Advocates used Caleb's story to argue for stricter oversight, clearer guardianship procedures, and protections for undocumented dependents whose existence was too easily erased by bureaucracy or neglect. In its final form, the photograph became more than a mystery. It became a memorial, a reminder that behind every missing case file or silent household lies a life that once waited to be seen, acknowledged, and remembered. The Grayson house, now fenced off and marked for historical preservation, stands as a solemn testament to the consequences of secrecy and the fragility of those entrusted to imperfect systems. And though the ultimate fate of Caleb remains unknown, one truth endures. The photograph ensured he would not vanish entirely. It captured him in the fleeting moment between presence and erasure, gifting him a permanence the world had denied him in life.